Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Golden, and I want to thank you all for joining our last webinar of the year. Before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about us. Dovetail Partners is a nonprofit organization that provides authoritative information about the impacts and trade-offs of environmental decisions, including consumption choices, land use, and policy alternatives. We have joining us today Catherine Fernholz, the president of Dovetail Partners, along with Dovetail associates and staff Eliza Meyer, Gloria Erickson, Grace Simmons, Harry Groot, Michael Snyder, Nia Becker, Teresa Floberg, Kathleen Priest, and Ed Pepke. If you want to learn more about their areas of expertise, you can visit our team page on the Dovetail website. We will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation, so please submit your questions for our team. With that, I'll pass it over to Katie to get us started on discussing forests and forest management.
Hi, I'm Katie Fernholz, President CEO of Dovetail Partners, and I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about forests and forest management, kind of the basics. Thank you to everyone who responded to our request for your ideas on what you wanted to hear us do in this fourth quarter webinar. The votes came in, and an introduction and overview to forests and forest management was the number one selection. And so I'm going to give a little bit of overview here, just some basics, some level setting, and then we're going to hear from a bunch of Dovetail team members and their direct experiences with forests and forest management in the places that they live and work. I am a forester by training, and so it's always fun to talk about trees. I'm going to talk mostly about the United States, but I do want to acknowledge forests are a global phenomenon. And there's so many things we could be talking about with forests when we think about the entirety of the planet. But just in terms of a little context from the global forestry perspective, this is a map showing two things. The light green shows where we have forests across the planet today. So that lighter green color is forests as they exist on planet Earth today, and about 32% of the Earth's land surface is covered by forests. The dark green shows areas of the planet where there were forests in the past, or where ecologically you could have forests theoretically because the conditions would support growing trees. So it shows you current forest area and kind of maximum potential forest cover that we could have on planet Earth. This is another map. This is the only other map I'll share that has a global context. And this is showing what's happening with forest area globally in recent years. And what you can see on this map is in some parts of the planet, the forest area is expanding. We're actually increasing our forest cover. That light green color is taking over that dark green color of the prior map. So you see those areas in blue and green shades here. There's a lot of the planet where it's a neutral, that kind of beige color, where forest area is kind of statistically unchanged. And then there are still a few parts of a few countries around the world where forest area is declining. But the takeaway message from this is there are lots of different forests around the world, and lots of different things are happening in those forests depending on local conditions, economies, regulations, national interests, all of those things. But take home message, it's not just one thing. There's so many different things going on with our forests. So let's transition to talking about North America, the United States. This is just a satellite image, just to kind of ground ourselves in understanding this landscape. I think many of us have seen an image like this, and it's a reminder of the complexity of our geography. Just even looking at a satellite image, we can see that this land is very different from north to south and east to west. We can actually map those ecological differences into ecological regions or ecoregions. And ecoregions are mapped by a whole bunch of different criteria. The growing season length, maximum, minimum temperatures, precipitation, whether it's rainfall, snow, how precipitation is received throughout the year, elevation, all kinds of different environmental conditions are data that help us map ecological regions. And as you can see on this map, ecological regions are often labeled by the type of vegetation that is dominant in that type of ecological condition. And if we look across North America, we can see that many of the ecological regions, so each color on here represents an ecological region that has different kind of climate, environmental conditions. And many of these ecological regions are labeled as forest types because they have the moisture, the climate, the elevation, they have the conditions to support growing trees. So we can see across the top of Canada into Alaska, the boreal forest region, conifers, spruce, fir, these kinds of tree species grow throughout that region. If we keep going in the eastern United States, like eastern mixed forest, all kinds of hardwoods and some pines within that eastern mixed forest that goes all the way from Minnesota to Maine. There's the eastern deciduous forest where you get into oaks. How many different oak species can we have in that eastern deciduous forest? It's a beautiful, not just oaks. I don't want to skip all of the other trees, but oaks are absolutely amazing. And then we get into that southeastern mixed evergreen forest, all of the loblolly, short leaf, long leaf, all of these different pine trees. That little tip of Florida is actually a tropical forest region. And then we skip over the grasslands in the Midwest, which is not a forested region. But then we get to the Rocky Mountain evergreen forest, which is that forest distribution is determined a lot by elevation. You have a little desert region there focused on Nevada, the Pacific coastal forest all along the West Coast, some of the oldest, largest, most amazing trees in the world. And then the California chaparral region, which is not really a forested region. But if we look across that entire map that you see there, from that West Coast boreal forest, Intermountain, but look at how much of that land supports trees, especially in the eastern United States, from Texas to Maine, Florida to Minnesota. That eastern region is really a forested region. So this map shows us where the ecology, the environment can support the growing of trees, kind of that ecological maximum of our forest cover in North America. This is the map zooming into the United States that shows us where we have forests in the United States today. So, spoiler alert, it follows the ecological regions. One of the determining factors, the first determining factor on where we have forests, is where the environmental conditions will support the growing of trees. And so unless you really modify the habitat of Nebraska, it's not going to be a densely forested region. But where we have the precipitation, the elevation, the climate for trees, that's where we have forests today. So you can see that area from Texas to Maine, Florida to Minnesota, that eastern forest region. You see that Rocky Mountain forest region. You see that Pacific Coast forest region. So the number one thing in terms of where we have forests is where the environmental conditions will support forests. So we know we can't have forests everywhere because environmental conditions won't support forests everywhere all the time. But the other factor that limits where we have forest cover is competing land use. So this is the map of where we have forests in the United States today. This is the map of where we have farmland today. And it's kind of like one of those, if anyone remembers when we used to still print out film and negatives, I'm going to flip through these one more time. Forests, farms, and you can see you can't have a cornfield and an oak forest on the same acre at the same time. These are very much competing land uses. So the distribution of forests is determined by the ecological conditions that support trees and also by these competing land uses. And the number one factor impacting competing land uses in the choice between farming and forestry has a lot to do with forest ownership. It's not the only factor. I don't want to oversimplify it, but it is a key factor. So in the United States, this is a map of the two big groups of forest land ownership. This is a simplification because there's a bunch of different types of public land ownership, a bunch of different types of private land ownership. Tribal land ownership is grouped in with private. But the point here is you can see that dark green color is public forest ownership in the United States. Predominantly in the West, we're talking about national forest, federal ownership, Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service lands. All of those types of public, federal, state, municipal, public lands are shown in dark green on this map. The light green color is all the categories of private land ownership. So whether it's families, institutions, investors, private industry, like I said, tribes are included within private ownership for the purposes of aggregation. But what you can see in this map is the eastern United States, that area that we've talked about, that Texas to Maine, Florida to Minnesota, that eastern forest region is dominated as much as 80% in some states, but certainly at least 60% across these states in private land ownership. Individuals making primarily economic decisions, also value-based personal uh, decisions for their land. But those lands, the private lands, are the most likely from generation to generation to move between forest and farm uses. As markets change, and as families make different decisions for themselves and for their family members. In the West, you can see that public forest dominates, especially in that Rocky Mountain region, but even along the coast. And so public forests are less likely to move between land management types, between farms and forests, because they're regulated. They're regulated by policy mandates in terms of what that land will be used for. So you see more stability within public land ownerships generally over time. But what this really tells us is as landowners are making choices for what to do, especially private landowners, markets will make a big difference. And surprise, surprise, hopefully what you've seen across all these maps is we have forests in the United States where we have the ecological conditions for forests, where we have private landowners choosing to grow trees, and where we have industry, economics, markets for the trees, for the wood products that those private landowners are producing. So it's these the data correlates, so to speak, between the ecology, the social values, and the economic incentives. Those three things come together to define the distribution of forests that we have in the United States today. And guess what? The research amplifies this correlation. This is from some work a few years ago, but nations with a strong forest product industry often show stable or expanding forest areas as sustainable management practices and economic incentives align to ensure the regeneration and conservation of these vital resources. If you remember back to that global map of forest area change, forest area in the United States has been stable to increasing for a very long period of time. For more than 5 generations at this point, we've had stable to increasing forest area. And that is because of that correlation between a beautiful, generous ecological baseline that allows us to embrace the potential of trees, the social values within our private landowners, multiple generations of families connected to the land, and a strong forest products industry and markets that create, the synergies between the ecology and the social fabric of our forests. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about wood products and harvesting and the sustainability of harvesting. So this chart says a lot. I've looked at this kind of data this tells the story, the history of forestry, forest products in the U.S. in one chart in a way that I think is, if you're a student of history, you know what you could layer into this chart as well. But this is data going back to the 1920s, so over 100 years. And what's shown on here is net growth. And so net growth across the forest area of the United States is so it's all growth, but then we subtract for mortality, wildfire, insect disease. So net growth is the amount of growth after we remove those kinds of mortalities. So net growth annually, and then removals, harvesting for all types of wood products, whatever they might be. But that's the two data shown on here, the yellow bars being net growth, the green bars being removals. And this is normalized over time for the expanding area of the United States, welcome Alaska and Hawaii to the party. And so this is normalized over time, or whatever the correct term is. Normalized might not be the term I'm looking for. But if we go back to the 1920s, you can see unequivocally that the harvest levels in the United States were not sustainable. In the 1920s, a little over 100 years ago, we were harvesting about twice as much as our net growth each year. So we were over harvesting. You can call this an era of exploitation. There's a bunch of labels you can put on what was happening 100 years ago, but by any definition, it was unsustainable. In the 1930s, what you can see is the removals. The harvest rate went down, primarily because of economic downturns, the Great Depression, limited economic development, construction, the use of wood, all of these things contracted in a contracted economy. But you can see the forest kept growing. The forest was like, wow, that Great Depression, that's terrible, but we're going to keep on doing what we do. And so the growth was going up. By the 50s, the economy was recovering post World War II. And so you can see the removals had come back up almost to the pre-war levels. And the forest also just kept on growing. And so since 1952, in the United States, on an annual basis, we have had higher net growth than harvest levels. Going all the way back to 1952, we have had higher growth rates than removal rates in the United States. That trend has continued, and you can see the gap, the excess or the abundance of growth above removals has expanded over time. You get all the way through, if we go forward to 2006, if you compare 1996 to 2006 and then to 2011, you can see the decline in harvest, the decline in removals, and that's a reflection in '06 and 2011 of the Great Recession and the decline in housing construction in the United States and harvest levels that declined accordingly. And you can see in 2016, even as the economy recovered, our harvest levels with this most recent data has been pretty flat, pretty flat. The other thing I want to point out is how net growth continued to grow until about 2006, really leveled off in 2011, and you can see the slight decline in 2016. So I want you to recognize when you look at this, net growth declined from 2011 to 2016, even though removals did not go up. So net growth and removals are two important data points, but there's a lot of different things that impact net growth in addition to the harvest rate or the removals. Net growth, as I mentioned, is also an incredible measure of mortality rates in this country. And we can see in the 2000s, in this most recent generation, we've all seen the headlines. We know that mortality in our forests is increasing due to wildfires, insect disease, natural disasters impacting our forests. And so even though our harvest levels have remained low, in proportion to even rates that we did in the 1950s, below rates in the 70s, even though our harvest levels are low, net growth has peaked and is declining because of mortality and forest health concerns in many parts of the country. The last thing to say on this slide is about 89–90% of those removals that you see on this chart are coming from those private forest lands that we talked about on the other map. Private landowners contribute the vast majority of harvests in this country. So pictures. I've shown you lots of maps. I threw in a chart. Let's look at pictures. In terms of that chart shows us, in bar graph form, what's happened over the last 100 years. But these are pictures. This is Massachusetts. Picture on the left is the 1880s. Picture on the right is modern day. And this is the story of what's been happening with our forests over the last 150 years. The eastern United States was a landscape dominated by farming for many generations. As farming moved to the Midwest, to that grassland ecoregion, the eastern United States has been reforested through active planting and through natural regeneration. Seeding, sprouting, and forests have come back. So there has been a return of forestry in the eastern United States from north to south, east of the Mississippi River, that whole region. Many, many parts of that region that were farms in generations past and are growing trees today. And so it's an amazing ecological recovery. There's a couple of caveats to what's going on. First of all, the land was cleared for farming, and it was farmed for many generations. It was plowed, it was grazed, the soils were eroded, there was compaction. All kinds of things happened to that land during the era of farming. And so the soils and the conditions that the trees in the East are growing on now today are different. There's a whole recovery, ecological restoration process that has to happen there because of the impacts of the era of farming on those lands. So it isn't just farm, put back forests, and we're instantly, fully ecologically resilient. There really is a restoration process that needs to occur across those landscapes. As you can see in the picture of the right, one of the indicators of that is in many regions, there's an abundance of certain species because that happened to be the seed source that was there at the time when people stopped grazing and farming and all of this kind of thing. So as you see in the right picture, in many parts of the Northeast, white pine came in very aggressively on old agricultural lands and is disproportionately represented in the landscape. And you see similar ecological overrepresentation in some of these regions, just depending on what happened to, luck of the draw when the farming stopped, which trees took over. So there's a restoration of, enhancing the diversity of those forests, restoring understory diversity, those kinds of things in the east. The good news is we're talking about forests that are native species. These are the trees, the types of trees that have grown in North America for thousands of years. And it's just a matter of nurturing and tending them as they recover and restore on these former ag lands in much of that landscape. That farming history is really the eastern U.S. story of forestry. In the West, we're really talking about fire suppression, and we're talking about ecological change as a result of those types of land management changes. So these are pictures, similar, comparison, photo reference points, 1909. 1948, that poor man is still standing out there. I'm teasing. I think they let him go home for at least a lunch break in between these photos. But you can see in 1909, this is a picture in Oregon, and very open forest because of a history of indigenous burning, use of fire, cultural fire, grazing history. Even during the time of European contact, there was a continuation of the use of fire for a time. And also there was grazing that maintained some of these open areas. But you can see in 1909 that it was an open forest and you could ride your horses through there. But by 1948, the era of fire suppression really started about 1910, in the 1910s. And by 1948, the exclusion of fire, the discriminatory treatment of cultural uses of fire. By 1948, you start to see the forest fill in those open spaces. By 58, you're seeing even more of that. In the 60s at this site, there was some harvesting that occurred, but still a very thick forest. Yeah. And then by 1989, we have a thicket. Yes, it's a forest, but I'm just going to call it a thicket. That's the word that comes to mind for me. And so if we compare, there's 93, 2015, there's a couple more here, but if we compare 1909 to 2015, it's the same spot in the landscape, but really unrecognizable in terms of the habitat changes. So a couple things, just like we talked about the East in terms of really that impact of farming and grazing. But, in the West, a couple things to understand is every one of those pictures I showed you, very quickly here from 1909 to 2015, every one of those pictures of a forest, those are all natural forests. They're absolutely not any one of those forests is bad or, we should only have this type of forest. No, 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 no. Those are all natural forests. Each one of those forest types provides benefit for wildlife or, for whatever it might be. And so each one of those forest types has their place in the landscape. The challenge for land managers is how much of which one and where in the landscape, because that forest type you see on the right from 2015 is going to have different impacts on water resources, on wildlife, and especially on wildfire risk. And so the forests you see, that are very dense, the thickets, thinking about where they should be on the landscape in terms of public safety, in terms of protecting sensitive ecological areas, all of those types of things. The forest on the left is another extreme. And where in the landscape is that appropriate in terms of both human benefits, wildlife benefits, water quality benefits? So there's a whole spectrum of conditions that forests can and should manifest themselves as. And as land managers, it's deciding how much, where, and how to care for that. So how do land managers make some of those decisions? Well, at risk of making every forester in the room roll their eyes, I am going to try and explain forest management in one slide. So apologies to all of the forestry professors that take an entire semester or 4 years to do this. But I'm going to let you in on the secret of how a forester's mind works. So in every forest, even if it's a planted forest where all the trees start out pretty similar, in every forest, foresters can identify these classes of trees. And so the dominant, these are trees where the canopy it's dominant. That canopy has full sun, it's up above the other ones. These are dominant trees that really have claimed their space in the forest. There are co-dominant trees that are holding their own, kind of shoulder to shoulder. And then you have suppressed trees that are in the shade. They're like, what about me? And these intermediate trees, they just threw that in there just to, make it even more complicated. But most of the time, dominant, codominant, and suppressed are the three types of trees in terms of where they are in the forest canopy, in terms of their access to light and their ability to control the space, the growing space that they need. So, as foresters, as we make land management decisions, we observe that. We observe how are these trees growing in relation to each other. And then we make decisions about how are we going to influence that. And so one of the management decisions foresters, ecologists, other land managers can always make is just leave it alone. If they're doing okay, just let them keep growing together. It's okay. One management decision is the passive, to do nothing management decision. And then to continue to monitor it to see if the condition changes and more active management is warranted. But when a forester or land manager decides to take action in management, I just want you to look at this image and think of all of the different things you could do in this forest. You could take a very light touch and just remove those suppressed trees. Just clean, it's called thinning from below. And it's also called capturing mortality. You could just take out the suppressed trees, maybe the intermediate trees, and it would be a very light touch. From a distance, you wouldn't even see that the canopy of that forest had been impacted. But you'd open up that understory, you might create, just a little bit of a different feel within there. And it's called capturing mortality because maybe some of those suppressed and intermediate trees in the next 5 years or 10 years are going to naturally die in this forest. And so if you harvest them now, they can be made into useful products or this kind of thing, and not contribute to buildup of wildfire threat, that kind of thing. The other thing you could do in this forest type is you could take the dominant trees. You could take the biggest trees out of there and you could allow the co-dominant and maybe some of the intermediates to fill in those gaps. Maybe you don't even open up a big enough pocket that enough sunlight would hit the ground and you would have young trees starting in that gap. So you could do that. You could do a combination of co-dominant. Okay, I'm going to stop because this is where foresters can debate forever about what you would do in that forest. And I want to make it clear that chart is a simplification. There are all kinds of research in forestry about all kinds of different ways to think through how to interact with forest canopies. This is irregular shelterwood systems. I mean, there's a whole bunch of silvicultural terminology around this. But what I want you to know from this is with forestry, when we make decisions around management, is a combination of what are we going to harvest and what are we going to leave in that forest for the forest to continue? It is a combination of what is removed as well as thinking about what is left and how that forest will respond to that management. Another key consideration within forestry when we do harvest is how are we going to be able to merchandise and use the material so that it's fully utilized, not wasted, and goes into a variety of products. So within a tree, from the base of the tree to the top of the tree, you end up with different materials. Usually the bottom of the tree, the butt log, the first lower log of the tree, it has the highest value. It's going to be the biggest, part of the tree. And so just in terms of diameter, you're going to be able to make larger products. Sometimes it's going to be veneer quality, those kinds of things. Then you get into the middle log, which might still be saw timber quality, and then you get into the top log, most likely to be a pulpwood, or for some of the lower value products, maybe pallets if we're talking about hardwoods. And then sometimes there's opportunities around the branches as well, if there's biomass markets, those kinds of things. And again, just like my Forestry 101 chart that oversimplified the forest, the elegance of utilization and use of byproducts within the forest industry is pretty amazing. That diversified forest, softwoods, hardwoods, so many different types of species going into this whole suite of products, from energy to building materials to paper packaging type of products, and how that flows through the whole system. Because the residuals from the forest and the residues from the sawmills that can move into these other parts of the manufacturing sector. So you really see this full utilization of materials coming from the forest and the diversity of products that come from it. And this is part of why this type of flow of materials and zero waste approach is part of how we see forests and forest products playing such a key role in the bioeconomy and in the transition to a more circular economy because these materials can flow between products. And of course, at the end of product life, there are opportunities for recovery and reuse through recycling or through energy capture from many of our wood products. So the last thing I will leave you with, besides just a final concluding slide after this, is sometimes when we talk about, just this opportunity around forest management and the abundance of forests in North America and all of the different things we can make from wood and from wood fiber, there's a concern that we're going to overuse wood. We're going to make the mistakes we made 100 years ago of overharvesting and overuse, that is a risk and a concern that we hold. And I think it's really important to acknowledge how much has changed in 100 years, how much monitoring and oversight we have of our harvest levels and of our allowable harvesting practices so that we do not repeat those mistakes. But another key part of this is really to recognize the overreaction we have had around really not embracing the opportunities to use wood. So this is data around world use of raw materials for 1961 to 2023, the most recent data available. And during this time period, global population growth was not quite 3 times, but 2.6 times the population that we had in 1961 we now have in 2023. So population growth is 2.6 times as much. Our consumption of all other materials besides wood has been at a much higher rate than population growth. So you can see steel, about twice as much steel consumption, a little less than twice as much steel consumption as compared to population growth. Cement, even more. Aluminum, even more. Plastics, yikes. So I know it's felt this way, but you now have the data to prove it. We have been living in the age of plastics. And that's there it is. You see it as well as I do. And when it comes to wood, our wood consumption has not even kept pace with population growth. And so on the one hand, that is an absolute triumph because a lot of that has to do with the zero waste I was talking about. We don't use wood and make wood products the way we did in the 60s. We use the byproducts, we use the sawdust. So we utilize wood in a very different way that has meant for the similar amount of harvest, we get more product out of it. So yay, the efficiency and the use of wood has been amazing. But the reality is we've shifted our consumption to other raw materials in a desire to preserve and protect forests. And there's an opportunity for us to rethink that and to say, it's okay. It's okay to use more wood and to rebalance our use of raw materials across these different categories going forward and end the era of plastics, the age of plastics. We can close that chapter. So I'll leave you with just a couple of values, just to transition into what the Dovetail team wants to share as well. For me personally, these are really grounding values that I carry with me in my relationship with forests and in my work with forestry. These resonate with me. I hope they'll resonate with you. But trees have life cycles. They're living, forests are living, changing dynamic systems. And these are life cycles we can learn about. We need to respect these life cycles and we can engage and be part of nurturing those life cycles. And wood is a material that it engages us in planting trees and growing forests. When we have a relationship with wood, we are in relationship with forests and trees. And it is a mutually beneficial and loving relationship. Because at the end of the day, forests and people are better together. We know that when we spend time in forests, it brings out the best in us. And we can do that for forests. Forests help us, and we can also do things that the forest really wants us to be doing. So with that, I'd like to invite the rest of the team to share some of their thoughts. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about forests and forest management. Well, then, our first question for discussion. What does forest management mean for you? Or how do you personally engage with forest management? What types of forests do you work with? What is your relationship with forests?
My experience with forests has been largely in the Appalachian forest. I don't have a forestry background. So when I first came to be engaged in forest management, I pretty much had no knowledge. I was starting from zero and I had to self-educate. And I talked to foresters, I talked to fellow landowners, I talked to loggers and people who were doing their own forest management on their own properties. And I have to say, when I started out, not only was I naive, but I was very much embracing the every tree is sacred, no tree should ever be cut down mentality. And over the, I guess, almost 45 years now that I've lived in this place in the Blue Ridge Mountains, in this forest, I've been able to see the effect of active management from high grades to clear cuts to selective timber stand improvement harvests and how those forests have responded over time. And I guess what struck me or still strikes me most is that when I started out knowing nothing about forest management, I didn't understand the long term nature of that management and the fact that you had to wait years and years to see what happened from the actions that you took. Most recently, we harvested about a third of our forest here, and our objective was to grow an uneven age forest. So the logger that I worked with came in and we worked together to mark the trees. And he took out, it was a worse first harvest. So it was basically a timber stand improvement harvest. And the resulting forest now has, well, it's beautiful. We have a whole bunch of nice, straight, tall trees. And we really enjoy being out in it and watching it grow, having a different profile of birds and animals that are inhabiting that we didn't have before when it was a pretty mature, overstocked forest.
Like Carrie said, when I first came, I moved to Ely on the edge of the Boundary Waters here 26 years ago. I was starry-eyed city folk who just wanted to be in the woods and be on a lake and knew how I felt when I was in the forest. It was a place that made me calm. But like Harry said, I knew nothing about taking care of the forest or even about the boreal forest up here. And through the 26 years I've been here, I've learned a lot. I'm not a forester either, but I got my dream 10 years ago of a little piece of land. I've learned so much, not only from my forestry friends, from indigenous folks, from local folks, about how to care for the land. The biggest thing too is the land tells me how to care for it. I actually moved to a property that was a clear cut at one point in time. So a lot of the trees here were balsam fir, very thick, and aspen. And again, I thought that thickness and right up to my cabin was the way it was supposed to be. And don't touch the forest because it's natural. But like I said, I've learned a lot, and I slowly started to thin out my forest. And at first it was about fire, about protecting my structure, my firefighters, about cutting down the flammable trees. But the more that I started to understand more about the forest, it's not just about wildfire, it's about health, the health of the forest. And like Harry said, I've known this land for 26 years, even though I've only owned it for 15. I've watched huge changes. Part of it are good because once I started thinning out the forest, I realized there were all kinds of little babies out there, and the diversity was incredible, and in different age categories. And when I look at my forest now, it really excites me about that diversity. It makes me sad about the spruce budworm and how it's devastated the balsams up here. But again, that's part of nature. And it is natural. It's just kind of devastating right now because it's been so thick of balsam. And once the balsam is gone, it's like, wow, what do we have left? But what we do have left are little baby red pines and white pines and ash and cedar. And again, for me, it's about how do I nurture that? What can I do? How much more can I learn? You know, that's what's important because the forest gives as much to me and I want to give that back.
So forest management is an area where I would apply and embrace the three pillars of sustainability. You look at environmental, social, and economic. And keeping all of those three things in mind with forest management decisions is critical to have healthy and resilient forests, and trying to find that balance of which of those pillars rises to the top in certain situations, but always coming back to that, keeping all three in mind is incredibly important. The environmental and conservation needs of the forest, promoting biodiversity and keeping forests, recognizing the huge social importance of forests for rural communities that rely on them for jobs, for recreation, and then the economic side, our markets, our forest products. And so that's, for me, entering this field, really understanding that foresters and people who dedicate their lives to forest management really embrace those pillars. And that is what good management is. Professionally, the work that I focus on in northern Minnesota has to do with approaching that management across a landscape, seeing the forest as a forest, not as ownership boundaries. And so really working to bring together different partners, land managers and landowners to find ways to work together and collaboratively to create those resilient forests we need, and integrate and embrace new management tools. Returning good fire to a fire-dependent forest is one of them that a lot of work has been focused on for our work in northern Minnesota. Personally, I live on 24 acres. Some of that is an old field from when it was a finished dairy farm, but the majority of that is a forested area. And so really working to understand what that property needs and how I can be a good steward of it so it is a healthy forest, or it can be returned to being a healthy forest in the years to come. It involves taking out invasive species, thinning out trees that are suppressing my red pines and white pines, reestablishing some cedars and birch in the wetter areas as you go down to the river. Talking with a forester on, maybe someday we will harvest the spruce that we have and all of those different components. And so taking a really active part in my property and getting to know it, pulling out balsam fir by its roots when it's just a sapling so it doesn't take a hold, since I'm not in a position to do a prescribed fire to, reduce some of those trees that I don't want to be dominant. So yeah, I think that's really what I've learned being back in Minnesota and doing this work, is that when you own property, whether it's a small lot or a, larger acreage, it's important to be part of it and be part of its disturbance. As the owner, that's up to you to help manage.
Yeah, I think folks have shared some really compelling stories of what forest management means for people that get to live and own forest land. I've been thinking about my relationships to forest and forest management as someone that lives in an urban area. I live in Minneapolis, and I grew up in a city in southern Wisconsin, which was historically, prairie land and some forests as well. And then have had some, just really transformational experiences, like many of us in the North Woods of Wisconsin and Minnesota, and these periods of like really strongly wanting and desiring to be in like deep relationship with forests and land. And so I think about forest management from a perspective of that interconnectedness of, what does the forest need from us? What do we need from forests? How do we both support each other? And so for me, a really important part of that journey has been learning about the history and, contemporary philosophies of Indigenous people that live and have always lived on these lands, really deeply understanding like relationship with land and what that means. I love living in a city. I think that's a push and pull I feel in my life of, really loving an urban area and what it means to live in an urban area, but also really deeply feeling connected to forested areas. And so wanting to have it a little bit both ways. But for me, that's the piece that I come back to is, recognizing that even as someone that lives in an urban area in Minneapolis, that I still am deeply interconnected with the forest, both on a personal level, in the time I get to spend in forests, but then also from this kind of broader societal piece of all of the ways in which I'm still deeply dependent on forests. And so for me, it's a matter then of figuring out, if I don't get to, at this point in my life right now, really tend to a piece of land, what does it mean for me to still be, in relationship with forests? And so the sort of path I've come to is figuring out how to do that through my work and, being involved with Dovetail and the work that we get to do from sort of a policy and practice and thinking about what does forest sustainability mean on a local level, on a state level, on a national and international level. And so maybe one day I'll live, on a plot of land and get to really take take part in some of that active tending. But I think that that's kind of a piece that we don't get to talk about as much, as what does it look like for people that live in urban areas to be involved with forest management, and that recognition that like we still are all deeply interconnected and in relationship with forests. And so it's just being able to bring out those different pieces and help all of us kind of own that connection, I think, is something I feel really strongly about.
I've been lucky enough to spend good time in forested regions around North America and the world. But I live in and focus on what we know regionally as the Northern Forest region of Maine to northern New England to northern New York, specifically in the Green Mountains of Vermont, where I live. I think of forest management as a component of a larger endeavor of forest conservation and forestry, which I think of really the peaceful and productive coexistence of people and forests. So this is the connection thing that everyone's talked about. It's not just trees, certainly not just wood. It's not just trees. It's not even really just forests. It's people and forests in a meaningful, livable connection. And so I'm 40 years into this, but really passionate about forest ecology, and in particular, the forest as verb thing, that it's forests are, so they do and they function and they're dynamic and complex. I'm really into that. But what I've learned, maybe the hard way over way too long a period of time, is that as complex as forests are, they're the easy part. It's the people part that is much more difficult. And I think that I come from a tradition of forestry, at least in the roots of it, where a fundamental mistake was made, which was that we focused on the forest and sort of took the people for granted. And I love watching particularly young people kind of get it right and actually put the focus on the people and the relationships with forests, from the woods, all the wood products and forest products that we use, to the spiritual and regenerative aspects of just spending time in forest. To me, that's it. It's forest management, coexistence, that we are part of the forest community. And if we're not, then we have real problems ahead. And all the solutions are in realizing that we're part of it and trying to find our way towards peaceful coexistence, which, with a basis in forest ecology, one can see that there really are great possibilities for getting this right. And we demonstrated all over the world at times, despite long histories of getting it wrong. But I see so much hope in the people side of connecting with forests, meeting our needs while meeting theirs in a reciprocal kind of way. I think forest management is so much more than human control and dominance to create wood products for society. It includes that. And I'm not ashamed of that, but I just think there's so much more, and that every day I draw breath, I hear and see examples of particularly young people in forest conservation helping us get this right and seeing it. And that makes me glad that I'm going to live forever, because I'm going to see this work out.
For me, this question really took me back to actually learning how to drive. I was born and raised and lived my entire life in the driftless region. And it wasn't until I was in college and learned that I actually lived in the driftless region that this passion came on to me, because I remember driving the steep hills of Galena, Illinois that are covered in snow, being scared out of my mind that I'm not going to get up a hill, or the big horseshoe type curves out in the countryside, that it kind of never came to me until I was older that I'm actually really lucky to live in a part of the Midwest that has this type of landscape. And it was learning that forests were really at the heart of all of that, and how it actually connects, forests to the waterways, to wildlife, to actually the small cities that are within the driftless region, that really sparked this passion to really take care of our forests. Because I guess for me, protecting the forest protects everything that I've ever known. Being grateful and being able to pay that kind of late bloom respect to the forests that I never understood I had such a privilege of living within. It kind of has a nostalgic importance to me, but also knowing that someday I'll hopefully be able to raise my family in the same area with the same landscape while being surrounded by all of this flat land. I truly, I guess, realized how lucky I was to live in this part of the Midwest.
Forest management, including harvesting, has always been has a positive connotation to me. And why? Maybe because I have a degree in forestry. But why positive? Because for me, with good management, wood and the other forest resources are produced sustainably forever.
But want to make sure we touch a little bit on products, the gifts from the forests, the materials, and really the way that our economy, our communities, our homes connect to the forest, what we're seeing around forest product innovation so that forests continue to be relevant for generations to come. But any thoughts people have around, the forest products that have really touched your life, or that you've made products from the forest, but just want to hear from the team in terms of that type of relationship with the forest, or anything you want to say. You're welcome to say anything.
So one product that I really like, which might sound a little funny, would be, I would say, hardwood pulpwood. But primarily because one of my hobbies involves growing gourmet mushrooms on wood. So of course, doing that on hardwoods work better, and pulpwood sized logs, maybe even smaller, maybe more so like bolt size. So a log that's going to be about 4 to 6 inches in diameter, maybe 3 feet long or so. A really nice thing about growing mushrooms, gourmet mushrooms, is that, ideally you're going to be using wood or wood or other woody substrates or biomass substrates that alternatively wouldn't really have very much of a use. So like maybe you're getting wood chips left over from an arborist. Maybe you're getting the smaller pulpwood from a timber sale that's not as valuable. Maybe there's, like around my area, there's not as strong of a market for oak pulp as oak saw logs. With the growing mushrooms on logs, it's a lot of the work is up front. You drill holes in the logs, put the mushroom spawn or the mycelium spawn into the logs, seal it with wax, and then just let it sit in a shady area for about 6 months or so, 6 to 9 months or so, depending on where you live. Will affect how long it takes. I inoculated some maple logs with oyster mushrooms this spring, and after I got home from a trip from this weekend, I was very pleasantly surprised to see some oyster mushrooms popping out. So those will be a very delicious lunch later on. Yeah, mushrooms, it's just a fun thing that I like. And of course, there's other forest products that are maybe a little more impactful, like on a day-to-day basis, such as structural timbers. My house is made of wood, so, of course, that's an important product too. The mushroom logs are fun.
We need wood and paper products. Wood is needed for house building. It's needed for furniture. It's needed for household items. Paper is needed for printing, writing, newspaper, sanitary needs. What would you do without toilet paper? You need to harvest trees to get these products, and they can all be sustainably produced. We can certify that they're sustainably produced. And wood and paper, they're recyclable, but only to a limit, because eventually the fibers break down. So you always need new wood fiber coming in. The demand for wood and paper is really what pays for forest management. If there was no demand for wood and for paper, then the forest wouldn't be managed. And without management, there would be none of the multiple benefits besides wood. They also the fire protection, the recreation, for water, for soil stabilization. And another aspect of this is the trade. So the trade of wood is really an important part of the forest sector in the United States. The United States, as earlier in the presentation, grows more wood than it harvests, and some of that extra can be exported. Some of it there's also imports of wood and paper. And that's because we don't grow or produce all the same things that we need. So this trade is also really important for the forest sector, and in part, it pays for forest management.
Are there innovations or are there things that you think forests and wood can do that you really hope to see more of in the future?
When it comes down to the things wood can do, I think sometimes it's important to remember that wood as a natural resource has always been here. It's always been something we've used. I mean, of course, if you're thinking of like a place that has trees, it's almost like when we're using wood to build our homes, to heat our homes, to produce energy or electricity, it's kind of like going back to the traditional ways in a sense. And I think that gives wood a lot of warmth, maybe figuratively, but also literally too, if you're heating your home with wood as well. So it's, you always see different like new technologies, new things, but I think at the end of the day, sometimes we can just go back to what we've always done. And I know, don't always do what you've always done is a kind of like a metaphor for like trying new things, but at the same time, like if it's not broke, don't fix it. And when you take good care of wood and your wood products, they can last forever and they don't break.
My experience with wood products has largely been informed by my training as an engineer. I've worked in manufacturing most of my career, and starting in the early 80s, I had the fortune, looking backwards, to enter into the natural resources realm from the manufacturing side. And since then, I have worked with every aspect of wood products, from the harvesting on to finished products, paper, furniture, lumber. Here, toward the end of my career, I've been focused more on the lower value end of the product chain. There's a huge potential for using the low value wood products for energy and for biochar specifically, which has a huge number of end uses, and which the research is progressing and experience is moving those products forward. And I think as we go on into the future, the use of bioenergy is going to become more and more important as our fossil fuels continue to decline. The ability to co-produce both energy and the biochar, which can be used as a soil amendment, stormwater mitigation product, provides a huge opportunity for that lower end of products. Meanwhile, the mass timber opportunity, I think, is starting to be realized and growing, and I hope to see that really expand in the future.
I think wood products offer a real solution for sustainability and a circular economy. I built a house out of logs that were sourced within the state where I was living, heated my home with heat for years, and that's certainly an option available more easily and readily to folks living in rural areas. But wood products and the potential they unlock come hand in hand with misconception of forest and forestry. You hear, I see on social media or, just in conversations, even people talking about deforestation as though they go by a clear cut or an area that's been logged and they use the term deforestation. It's like, well, no, that'll remain a forest and that's the goal. If you choose to not use wood products because you're worried about deforestation, you're actually contributing to a reality where forest products will lose value and not have a demand, and forest owners will make a different decision about their forests and could convert it to development, ag land, and that's when we have deforestation. So using wood products, finding new innovations for wood products is going to be critical for keeping our forests. And really, we should be championing and rallying around a future of using forest products to replace plastic, to find ways to keep forests here for our environmental and social benefits with that economic component. So I think for me, it goes hand in hand, is that let's keep having value of forests and using our forests to create a future of forests.
Kathleen here. I can't be seen, but maybe I could be heard. Just very briefly listening to all of you, and I so take to heart your discussions about mushrooms and products and forest management. Gloria, I especially relate to your talk about a healing place. As the citizen of a town whose millions of trees were destroyed in June by a derecho, I was thinking that perhaps just appreciating the presence of trees in our lives without ascribing any value to them, any future to them, any past to them, just feel their presence, because I can tell you that I live in a town now that is breathless at the loss of its trees. And like Gloria, it makes me tear up at the thought. And I know that's simplistic, but I think it's important to keep in mind when you step out your doors, and whether it's urban or rural trees, just their presence.
So my favorite wood products to use, going back to that second question, I am a paper towel lover. I use paper towels all the time. It actually used to make my husband angry until I told him, nope, I'm contributing to the markets by using paper towels all the time. So that is the wood product that I love in my household for sure. And then going back to the wood innovation piece, I ran into someone at a conference and they talked about, funny enough, I live near Georgia Tech University, which is a college where a lot of engineers go. And they were talking about working with graduate students who were taking lignin and using it for batteries as a replacement for graphite, I believe. And it was really interesting because they were starting with a really tiny battery, obviously, but his goal was, this would replace, electric cars, the battery used in there. And so I just thought that was such an interesting innovative, way to use wood. And it was cool because I live literally right near Georgia Tech. So that was just a cool, close to home, innovation piece.
I would invite any comments on misperceptions, or another way to phrase it is what you wish more people knew about forests, something you wish that more people believed in or held to be true, or something you believe in that you want to share.
I guess I would share a misconception that I had about forests when I was a young forester just learning, was that I didn't realize that clear cutting was like a valid, legit, like silvicultural technique. I just had, we all learned about what happened in like the late 1800s, early 1900s, where the old timey lumberjacks basically clear cut everything. And my misconception was just that, oh, we don't do that anymore. Come to find out, of course, clear cutting is still done, but done in a more sustainable way, more typically with species that are well adapted to that, such as aspen. They need the wide open spaces to be able to regrow, and they regrow very readily. So that was just one misconception that I had, but there's certainly many other misconceptions about forest and forestry out there too.
I can jump in. I think some folks have touched on this already. Maybe Harry, we talk about like the time horizon of forest and forestry, and I think foresters like to joke that they see everything in, terms of 50 years or whatever it may be. But I think that that's something that is helpful to invite people to think about, that the life of a tree oftentimes, surpasses our human lifetimes, or it can in certain areas. And so to just have that patience, I think, with trees and with forests and with our understanding of forest management is really important. We're really used to this kind of 1 year agricultural cycle, and thinking about any sort of natural growth through that lens. And I think we have this desire to have things be exactly as we want them right away, which is not how forests and trees work. It's going to take time. And so I think there's just that element of patience, whether it's, a forest management treatment or whatever it may be, a timber harvest, things that might kind of look messy right away or feel uncomfortable right away. I think that a lot of us, can grapple or understand that feeling of like discomfort, whether it may be a loss or a change. And many of my colleagues have alluded to just that feeling of watching things change and then knowing that we need to be patient for the next evolution. And I think that that is something that I would invite more people to think about in terms of their relationship and how they view the forests around them.
One misconception is that deforestation occurs worldwide, including in North America. And this is simply not true. Worldwide, we grow more timber than what we harvest, especially in the United States. However, yes, deforestation does occur in some areas of the world.
Misconception about forests is that they're static. People go to their parks, go out in the country, and they see the forest, or you can even fly over it in an airplane, and there's a blanket of a forest. And I think many people see that and capture that picture in their head without realizing that it is in constant change and always will be.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, I hope all of the attendees, participants enjoyed that discussion and hearing really some of the relationships each of our team members here at Dovetail have with forests and the storytelling. Hopefully, that sparked some of your own stories and your own relationship with forests, your own thoughts about what forests and wood products mean for you. So we have a little time left here for Q&A. So I'd invite team members, go ahead, turn on your cameras. Maria, you'll help me work through the Q&A that we have. And let's see what we can start with. What do you think we should start with, Maria?
Yeah, so the first question we have, it actually is for you, Katie, and it's what role can nonprofits play in bridging the gap between smaller landowners and certified wood product markets?
Awesome. Good. So yeah, forest certification, something I've worked with for a long time, including family forest certification and group certification. And nonprofits have a key role to play, especially with engaging small landowners, family forest owners. And in general, there's a spectrum of nonprofit roles with certification. On one end of that spectrum it's access to information, answering questions, just raising awareness. What is certification? Just helping landowners know about the possibilities that exist. So education is one end of that spectrum. I would also say for nonprofits that have the capacity and the knowledge to provide technical forest management assistance, the other end of that spectrum is to actually establish a group certificate and to enroll landowners as members in your group certificate and to really be the avenue for accessing a forest certification program. So somewhere between helping answer questions to getting it done, nonprofits can play that role. And it really depends on what their skill sets are and their expertise is. But at the Dovetail website, there's reports on group certification, family forest certification, topics like that. But if that's something somebody in the audience is working on, I would be happy to provide additional details. But there's a great role for nonprofits to help with accessing certification.
Great. Thank you, Katie. We looked at, a lot of pictures of maps during your presentation. So curious, what would the US map look like in 1491?
Excellent. Great question. So ecologically, and I think this is interesting for the team to think about, because that's part of the reason in that presentation we show that map of ecological capacity, those ecoregions, because as best as we can estimate, in prior to what's considered the modern era of forest management, these kinds of things, that ecological region map would have been the full extent of forest within North America. So the estimate is that prior to European contact, there likely was about 1 billion acres of forest in what is now the United States. Today, we have about 750, 760 million acres. So over 70% of the land that could be forested in this country is forested. But in 1491, that's what you would have seen, is all of those ecoregions covered with forests, and many of those forests, of course, maintained through human actions, cultures that had deep relationships with those forests prior to European settlement.
Thank you, Katie. Let's switch gears a little bit. How does biomass fit into forest management?
I'm going to ask you, Harry. Do you want to chime in on this? If you talk about biochar, that's fine, but start with biomass. What do you think, Harry?
Okay, I assume we're talking about biomass as the non-commercial portion of the tree. So it's the slash that's typically left behind after a harvest. Personally, I'm a big advocate of bioenergy. So to me, a lot of that material could go into heating and electrical production for base load. Yes, I'm also a big advocate for biochar. I have to get a plug in here on that. Co-production is, I won't say easy, but it's quite possible with the existing equipment that we have, and the market and the interest in using biochar as a product is growing worldwide. And the research is following to back up that development of both those markets and the use as well as practical experience.
And what makes biochar so fabulous, Harry? That was a question from one of our registrants.
Uh-huh. I guess the thing that caught my attention originally with biochar, and I came to biochar from working in bioenergy, and the biochar, as the bioenergy market declined, my interest in biochar grew as it developed into more of a viable commercial product. And the last paper that I saw that was looking at the potential uses of biochar listed 55 specific uses and that number has actually grown as more research has progressed, where in the pyrolysis process, different additives, mainly minerals, and manipulating the process variables have created different varieties of biochar, which can now serve different applications. So to me, it's just a fascinating product with a really, I hope, bright future.
Perfect. Thank you.
And thank you for asking.
Thank you. We know biochar is fabulous. Let's see. We have some other questions here. We have quite a few questions.
Hey, Maria, what if there's some questions there around really interacting with privately owned forests, and really what are the regulations that can help? So Teresa, Gloria, could you speak to kind of how you work with some of the federal programs, some of the ways that you engage landowners in caring for their forests, wildfire risk mitigation? I mean, what's that intersection between the federal and state resources and helping private landowners with their forests? Gloria, if you want to pass, say, feel free, but what do you think, Gloria? Go ahead.
I'll just hopefully touch on lightly, and Teresa can jump in here. I've been working with landowners on wildfire resiliency issues for like about 15 years. And the kind of resources available, I mean, as a Dovetail team member, the biggest thing I do is providing them with information and connecting them with different experts in the field. And there are a lot of grant opportunities, cost share grant opportunities to help them manage. And again, especially if they have larger pieces of property, to get them connected with those people to create a land stewardship plan, a way to manage their land. So it's not just about fire, it's about protecting their properties and for future generations. So there are federal programs, state programs, and county programs. The key thing that I've found is that people, need information, at least to begin with, to be able to make the choices about their land and how to manage their land. Teresa, you want to jump in?
Yeah, and I'd, qualify that the landowners Gloria and I predominantly work with in northern Minnesota aren't necessarily landowners who are managing their forests for, say, timber harvest, for that revenue. It's certainly an option available to landowners, and working to connect them with Minnesota DNR when that is their interest. But one of the emphasis we take communicating to private landowners is helping them, explore their forest and understand its relation to the larger landscape, making decisions that will make their property and their home more resilient to wildfires, but also connecting them with foresters to think about things like climate adaptations, like what is their forest going to look like in 50 and 100 years, and the work they can do today to start preparing for that and making sure that that forest stays healthy for their lifetime and the lifetime after. As Eliza alluded to in, her reflections, forests are, it's the long game. And so really taking that active role, knowing that you may not see some of those benefits in your lifetime, but that's not why you do it. You do it so forests remain forests forever. So.
Awesome. Good. And Maria, I know you're the timekeeper and we're just about out of time. So before we wrap up though, Eliza, Nia, Maria, anything, just any final reflections you want to share? Eliza, anything you'd like to say before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think it's really great to hear from the whole team. And I think there's a couple questions in here that we haven't gotten to around carbon storage and sequestration in forests and some of these specifics of forest management. I encourage folks to check out the Dovetail website for additional resources. There's also, most of our team is based in Minnesota. There's some really great recent research out about carbon storage and sequestration in Minnesota that I would encourage folks to look at too, from the University of Minnesota and the Minnesota Forest Resources Council. Yeah, I think that's it from me.
Awesome. Thank you. Nia, anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, I'd just say it's been great to get everybody together for this discussion, and I want to thank everybody for attending.
Absolutely. Good. And Maria, the floor is yours. You can take us home. Thank you. Go for it.
Yeah, I will for sure. I did share a link to our report. So if you are interested, it's in the chat. But I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. You know, we are a nonprofit and we strive to keep these webinars accessible to everyone by not requiring a registration fee. So if you find value in our work and are in a position to support us, we invite you to consider making a donation. You know, every contribution, big or small, helps us continue using or supplying reports and webinars. Also, stay tuned because we will be announcing our 2026 webinar topics very soon. And I'm going to be following up with all of the participants with an email that contains our recording to this session and also a feedback survey. So please fill that out so we can know what to talk about in 2026. But as always, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.